Hey, good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Dennis Sanford-Casey. I'm a principal consultant with Equifax. I've been kicking around bureau world for sort of 22 years. I've spent the past 16 of those working in the world of debt collection. And my primary role is to work with clients such as yourselves, and I sit between our analytics team, who are the uber clever mathematicians that do really clever modeling, etc., and our sales team, who go out and sell the processes. And I work with clients to design data solutions to understand what are you trying to do, what are you capable of doing, and we'll then look at what we can actually create and build based around that. And that'll be anything from trace, contact strategy, finding customers, propensity to pay, litigation scoring. I kind of get involved in all of those areas, right from pre-arrears, so before customers are even getting into debt, through early stage, late stage, and into recoveries. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about sort of the data piece. The presentation that we're going to go through is actually in sort of two distinct parts. So the first part that we will do is effectively a bit of a macro trends. So we'll just give you a bit of an overview of some of the data and kind of what we're seeing. And then the second part of the presentation will drill a bit more into, okay, bureau data, how can you use it, how can it help you, how can it help customer outcomes and sort of drive what you guys are doing with your customers. So when you look at 22 and so far into 23, cost of living has been sort of quite a key area that everyone's been looking at and talking about. You know, the BBC have even got their own graphic as to how bad things are, just as they did during the 2008 credit crunch. So you know things are pretty bad when that starts happening. You turn on the news and everything's very dire and everyone's in a terrible position. But is it that bad? And I think that's one of the interesting areas at the moment, because one of the things that seems to stand out is mainstream media particularly need to have sound bites. They need to sort of get a lot of information across very quickly in a way that people can understand. And that tends to sometimes distort what's actually going on, because when you look at the data, the reality is it's actually quite dull. And if you get someone like me and you stick them on the news in front of people, we'll just bore people and they'll turn off. Now, hopefully, for the next 20 minutes or so, you won't, and I can actually keep you engaged in the process. I will try. But the point is, there's a lot going on at the moment. And, you know, so there are some challenges, absolutely, but there's also some quite contradictory information. I was chatting to one of my opposite numbers from one of the other bureaus at the end of last year, and actually they're even more bullish than we are, that they believe the data is actually very good at the moment when you kind of look at what's actually going on. And we think, for example, that one of the things which is happening, and we'll try and show you in some of the first few slides, one of the differences now compared to sort of previous years and previous potential recessions has been around employment. Employment is currently remaining very high. So because employment is high, people have actually still got money. They're not out of work and they haven't got any money. So that's sort of making a difference. So what seems to be going on this year and what we sort of believe is happening is it's more cutbacks tend to be the order of the day. So that's what we think we're actually sort of seeing in the data. So what we've got, first few slides are just a few graphs around kind of macro trends. So what you're actually looking at here, and hopefully this will work. Can you still hear me? Fine. Do I need to turn it on? How's that? Is that better? Right. Let's try again. Can you hear me? Yeah? Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to move to point to some graphs for you. So what we've got here, index graphs, these first few. So this is taking an average from 2019, and that's your 100 in the middle. That's that dotted line in the middle. And then we're looking at trends over time of peaks and troughs as to data that we can see coming in. Okay. So for example, wherever it goes high, that's obviously where we're seeing more than the average at that time. Low is below the average. So you can quite clearly see on these first two, I'm looking at credit card data and loans data, that for example, during COVID, there was a big drop in what we had coming through. Now, that's not really a surprise, because we kind of know that during sort of the COVID period, people weren't borrowing. People were actually paying things down. More money was actually being saved, and you can kind of see those. But the other bits that do stand out is that you can see that this data covers 4 Christmas periods, and the Christmas periods always sort of have a peak sitting around them, which are all kind of these bits here, okay? So you can kind of see what's actually going on with the data and the peaks. As it approaches Christmas, people either take out more loans or potentially get sort of new credit cards. Now, the interesting bit when we start to look at during 2022 from a credit card perspective is actually, it's relatively flat. Yes, you've got spikes up and down, but overall through 22 it's pretty flat. Then there's a big spike on the run up to Christmas. That's probably a slight data anomaly in fairness as well, but actually you can still see it peaks and then it drops off actually on the run up to Christmas. But overall, sort of new credit cards flowing through the system, increasing a bit, but not drastically, okay? And the same when you start to look at loans. Again, you can see all these peaks running through, pick up to Christmas 21, it then settles down as it's done every other year throughout 22. But the one subtle difference we can start to see now as we get towards the end of 2022 and the run up to Christmas, there is an increase, but it remains relatively sustained. And that's an interesting part. So from a loans perspective, people have got the confidence to get loans, and actually the data shows they're then saying relatively sustained. So perhaps people are using it to get through Christmas, to help themselves get the things they want to. Because something else that happened a lot last year, was that me? Hopefully not. That happened a lot last year was people kept going on holiday. People did keep spending, which was quite counterintuitive to what was actually expected. Now, I only then take another two areas which are interesting, mail order and then telecommunications. So mail order just follows a very consistent pattern, which is every Christmas a massive spike and then it drops down. Okay, so each of those, and actually even during COVID, you can see the COVID Christmas went absolutely nuts, because everybody knows that during COVID, couldn't go anywhere, so everyone started ordering stuff online. Okay, so mail order accounts went through the roof at that point, and again, coming into Christmas 21, doing the same, and you can see for Christmas 22, doing the same. Okay, so those patterns, again, relatively flat, and even during the back end of last year, cost of living, people were still opening accounts, people were still going to mail order, people were still ordering things. So that's quite an interesting pointer. And then this is again one of the other little snapshots which is interesting and starts to back up a little bit of the theory that we think some of the changes that are going on. So when you look at telecommunications, again, it's fluctuating, you can see at Christmases, there are these spikes. And again, you can kind of see when new products are released. Now the interesting one, from a telco perspective, particularly in communication accounts, is this sort of sustained drop here towards the end of 2022. And again, part of the belief at the moment, looking at the data, is people haven't just been rushing out and buying the latest iPhone 14. That's the kind of area they're particularly looking to save money. So when their Sky package comes to an end, they're straight on the phone and they're negotiating much faster to keep prices lower. But they're not cancelling. And that's an interesting thing. People aren't scrapping these services. They're just either not buying newer, latest technology, or alternatively, they're just trying to get onto better deals slightly quicker. So that data kind of shows effectively what we're not seeing is massive differences. What we're not seeing is huge increases in defaults, people getting to financial problems, real distinct issues in the data. Actually, when you look at the accounts flowing through, it's staying relatively flat. And when you start to look at arrears cases, so here, this is just percentages. So between the lines, you've got 0.5% differences, okay? So this is, you've got the blue lines, which is the one payment in arrears. The red line is 2 or more payments in arrears. And again, you start to look at the trends. And again, yes, there's been a bit of an increase during 2022. But, and this is a really key thing that's been coming out from a lot of people we're talking to, when you look at where 2022 has ended, it's actually still below the pre-pandemic levels for a lot of sectors. So again, when you look at credit cards, when you look at loan performance, yes, there has been an increase, fine, okay, but it's still below peaks that have been seen previously. So actually, it's just keep following on this story that what we're currently seeing at the moment is it's not a disaster. Everything's not going to hell in a handcart. It's not all falling off a cliff. Actually, the data's, yes, it's increasing, but it's actually remaining quite static. And in each case, it sits below the peak of just before the pandemic. So it's almost more going back to business as usual, as opposed to terrible recession, awful data. It's all a bit of a nightmare. And again, you can see that in the mail order side as well. Mail order is keeping relatively flat and again below pre-pandemic levels. The one area, and actually there's another one that sits alongside this, which there has been more of a subtle increase, is telecommunications and utilities, funnily enough. Utilities isn't really a shock, to be honest, because most people's utility bills have gone up a lot, so therefore we are seeing arrears increasing, but not ridiculously. Okay, so again, these early stage arrears, the utils lines are very similar to the telco. So there's a bit more of a sustained increase. A lot of telecommunications companies are looking at that, trying to figure out why is there a bit more of a sustained increase. Quite a few of them have been in growth mode. That's one of the things we're kind of aware of at the moment. So because they're in growth mode, they are taking more risks. As we saw before, we've got less new accounts opening. They still want to keep growing. So they're starting to target customers they haven't traditionally targeted. So that could partly be what's flowing through. They've made riskier lending decisions, particularly on phones, etc. And that's now suddenly leading through to a slight increase in arrears. But again, what you can see here is it's still below the peak that we've seen before, but is now actually rising above the more sustained traditional area. Now that could start to flatten, okay, because this again is running into Christmas, so you could see a tailing off of those. So effectively within this data, so what we're seeing is, the trends are remaining quite static to how they were before the pandemic. We are seeing accounts that are coming through, accounts that are opening in specific areas. We are seeing arrears generally increasing, but not massively. Okay, they're kind of going back to normal levels. So it's just trying to hopefully give you a bit of a picture that when you look at this level of data, yes, there are challenges. Yes, people are cutting back, but actually they aren't missing loads of payments. We haven't seen a massive spike in defaults. The data is showing a slight increase, and that's what our clients are then trying to work with. And when we then sort of look at this slide, again, this is quite an interesting one. That this is actually taken from some open banking data, okay, so from clients and just tracking what we can see. And, and again, overall, it's not too bad. Some interesting ones, an increase in benefits going up. So more people are claiming benefits, which is quite interesting, and the amounts they're claiming is going up. Monthly debt payments, seeing those increasing as well. Not massively surprisingly, disposable income has dropped, but again, not sort of shockingly. So you look at that data and you can kind of see, yeah, people effectively are moving where they spend their money. That's one of the things that we're seeing. There's kind of an evolution of where it's going, and that's why when we chat to clients at the moment, and we go and we talk particularly to DCAs, generally people aren't seeing massive breaks in payment rates. Generally arrangements seem to be remaining sort of ticking along, staying relatively flat. People aren't going, oh, there's huge break rates, it's looking awful out there. No, it's not. People are kind of managing their finances. They don't have as much disposable income, and they're not spending it on the nicer things, but they're managing and they're getting through. And that's one of the interesting trends we're seeing at the moment. Okay, so from there, so we've talked a bit about the data and what we can actually see in the data. The next sort of piece that goes alongside that is then, okay, how can the data then sort of start to help you? Okay, what can you actually do with the data to try and help your processes, to try and get more out of your customers, particularly those that are falling into collections. The previous session talked a bit about complexity in collections and sort of some of the challenges with it. And, I'm going to mention consumer duty because that is in there. There's a lot of pressure to find customers who are starting to get into financial difficulty more and more. So companies have to start thinking about these processes. So it does actually mean, hold on, before people even get into arrears, you need to be thinking about what's going on with them. Once they hit arrears, what are you going to do with them? What process? You can't just put everyone through the same strategy. You need to start trying to understand them. Well, if you're going to do that, one of the key things that you do want to try and do is ultimately sort of build trust in your customers. Because if you can get them to trust you, then you start to get into a position where they're more likely to engage you. One of the things about trust is actually a very emotive word. And I'm sure everyone in this room will have their own thoughts and feelings about who you trust and why you trust them as well. A definition of trust is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. So the best example of this is the saying, relationships are built on trust. And this definition has three key words: reliability, truth, or ability. So these are the foundations that it's built from. Now, a minute ago, someone asked a question about open banking and kind of where it sits. Now, see, one of the key things with open banking in any sector, whether it's in acquisition, whether it's in the collection space, is you need explicit consent from the consumer. So to get explicit consent, you have to be in contact with them. So to get them to contact you and then share a massive amount of data with you, you've got to build trust. So you've got to show that you understand the position that they are in, and you, more than anyone else, understands what's happening to them, and you can help them. So that's where, when you start to think about trust and kind of what you need to do with your customers, understanding their position, using the data, potentially before you've even had any contact at all with them, can help drive your own messaging. When you sort of look at this picture on the right-hand side here, these are your customers. Well, potentially you've got a family there, you've got young executives, good career, flying high, he's on the iPad, he's looking for a new holiday home. Or potentially you've got a family who are private rental family. They're more transient, They're struggling to pay for things. They don't believe they should pay for much of the utilities because actually the utilities are making too much profit, so why should they sort of help them do that? They've got a moderate income and some benefits to help supplement it. Or alternatively, you could have someone that's lost his job, looking for a new job, sitting there, currently got childcare problems, they're on benefits, feels there's less opportunity out there. So depending on which of those three the customers actually are, the messaging you send and how you try and engage them is critical to whether they are likely to respond or actually try and engage with you. So the wrong messaging, you could end up offending them. They might just ignore you. In some cases it might be that, for example, in that first instance, the direct debit was set up incorrectly. And if you get the messaging wrong, they'll just think it's some kind of weird sales thing and just stick it straight in the bin because they've never had any problems before, it's fine. So understanding customers, knowing what they fall into, is actually really important. Customers that are in financial difficulty and are struggling to pay are 46% less likely to engage. Now, everyone here should know that. That's not a surprise. It's in most surveys that you see. So when someone is in financial difficulty, what you say in that initial contact becomes really critical as to whether they decide to engage you or talk to you or see if you can help them get out of the predicament that they're in. So therefore, trying to use data, using all the data sources you can to build up a picture of your customer. Now, that starts to get into your own data. They're your customers. You know these people. Far too often, companies seem to have a brick wall between their CRM system and their collection system. And it's almost when someone moves from being a customer into arrears, almost everyone starts from the same point and starts afresh. We shouldn't do. You've got things that no bureau, that no other data supplier can tell you about your customers, particularly customers who have been with you for a long time. You then have external companies such as the bureaus that can give you data, particularly around the financial information. You have third-party data providers that can give you things like consented emails, consented phone numbers as well. So there's lots of different data elements out there, and it's about trying to use that to understand your customers so that you can potentially build trust with them. If you don't understand your customers and you don't know the position they're in and you get the messaging wrong, this slide's just a little demonstration of the kind of things that you can see and ultimately where it can go a bit wrong. So this was taken from a project that we worked on, and it specifically shows customers in financial difficulty. That was the key thing. Now, all of these customers, before the data was processed, had all gone through the same path. So everyone had been in the same strategy, the same dial strategy. So we then appended the data and said, right, at the point you were running the strategy, here's how the customers, here's how we would rank them for you. So you can see the red bar are those we were saying were in financial distress at the time. So first thing, it's fairly obvious, not surprisingly, is the recovery rate is well below anyone else's. They really didn't pay anything. More call attempts than any other group. So they didn't know these people were in distress and they kept trying to just get hold of them, trying to dial them, trying to letter them. So more attempts were made. And actually, they got through to fewer of them than any other group. And then they actually had less outcomes than any other group. And that didn't just involve payment. That was any outcome they could come to. The other piece of information we have, which isn't on the slide, was also the average call time was considerably longer. So if you don't understand the position that your customers are in, what you end up with are customers that you end up trying to call more, get through to less of them, spend longer on the phone with them, and then are less likely to get an outcome. So that's why I just wanted to sort of flag that one. Oh, changing mics, thank you. I thought I'd just flag that one up because what that sort of shows and highlights is if you don't understand your customers, then ultimately you are less likely, particularly those in financial distress, to get them to engage, to get them to talk to you, and then ultimately come to a resolution of the problem that they're actually having. And what you're really trying to do is get customers to engage you, to talk to you, to come to an arrangement, to either pay in full, to be referred to a debt management company, whatever suits them best as you take them through a journey. And if you get your messaging right and you build the trust and you get the engagement, that's where you can then get into the world of areas such as open banking to then understand more about your customers. So when you start to do that, we've talked about the open banking piece, which is at the end of everything. That's when you are engaging and talking to your customers. But actually what you also want to do as well is use your data elements to design your strategies And your strategy should then influence your processes. And that allows you to put operational processes in place to then engage with those customers. So this is just an example that we have on the screen of how we talk to our clients about, okay, what you're trying to do, potentially before you even engage any of your clients, is understand the position they're in. Use the data, create your strategies. Now actually the bit on the right, and I'll talk a bit more about these on the next screen, they are just sort of examples of what we try and do, which is taking the data and turning it into something meaningful, something that can be operationalized and pushed into your systems. Now ultimately, and this is one of the key things, whatever your systems are capable of has to match to whatever you decide to do with the data. So if you've got a collection system and you can only run 3 strategies, whatever you create at the end needs to only be 3 strategies. If you've got a system that can cope with 10, fine, you do 10. It's all about taking the data and turning it into operational use. And all you're trying to do is use different layers. So for example, take a score. Now that can be an acquisition score, it can be a bureau score, it can be a recovery score. There are lots of different scores out there. Whoever your providers are, you can use scores. One of the things about scores as a layer is they tend to be less transparent. Scores are a number. So one of the things you're trying to do is make a process which is accountable and is as transparent as possible. So if it's transparent, you can then explain to any regulator querying why you've done something, why that customer ended up going down that particular route. But having it as a layer within a process is absolutely fine. You can then use things like litigation type data to help drive processes. You can use financial difficulty information. You can use traditional bureau data. You can use your own internal data. And all of those come together. So what you get into a position of is potentially understanding your customer's ability to pay before you've even started to engage them. If they're in financial difficulty, is it resilience? Is it stress? Is it financial difficulty that's causing the issue? Have they potentially gone away? And that's a really key area as well, because if your customers have moved, the question was asked earlier, when's the best time to do it? And then the comment was made around when you know it's wrong. Well, if you know it's wrong before you're even trying to engage them, you're going to get more information which is correct about the individual. Because from a bureau side, if you look at the wrong address, you are potentially looking at incorrect information to then make your decision on. So you need to understand where your customer actually is. Just as a real life example, one of our family members recently got in touch with me because they'd had a CCJ issued against them and didn't know why. So I said, okay, go and have a look and find out where it was issued. It turned out it had been issued at 2 addresses previous to where he was living now, and ultimately he got it set aside. Now it's fine, he's got the debt sorted and he's sorting it out because it was something to do with his business, but it still cost the company that did it time and effort to get it issued, but it then got set aside because it was an address that he wasn't actually at all and he hadn't had a chance to respond to it. So knowing where your customers are is really critical from not only the bureau side of understanding what's their bureau data telling you, but actually you want to try and get hold of them, to speak to them, to talk potentially about payments. So that's really critical. And that's why that very top layer on there is confirm location, know where your customers are, because that will drive the rest of the process. And this is just an example of the kind of areas that we put together for our clients, the kind of segments that we can create. And what this actually allows you to then do is start thinking about resource allocation. And that's really key. Far too often we see customers that are coming into collections that are actually in theory self-cure customers. They should never hit collections. Now, if they do, your KPIs look great because they come in, they pay, and they go out again, which is brilliant. But they're wasting time and resource. They are the preemptive group. You go proactive on them. Okay, so when you find those customers and you can identify them, you send them text messages, you let them know payments are coming in. Far too often, particularly in the telecommunications sector, we see direct debits not aligned to when people get paid. So what happens is they try and collect the direct debit, person hasn't been paid yet, direct debit fails, falls into collections, they then will reattempt the direct debit later on, and then it clears. Now it's coming to collections, but it's gone out again, so it looks good, but it does it month after month. So it skews the KPIs. That's kind of going, you shouldn't be doing that. If you know they're self-cure, treat them, engage them, let them know payments are coming, realign your direct debits, make it an operational piece. If you know they're gone away, fine, find out where they've gone. Whether you're using a trace agent, whether you're doing it internally, whatever the process is, find out where they've gone. Because when you know where they've gone, then you can rerun the process to understand more about your customers, and they will change the segment that they then fall into. Those that are in, and what that allows you to then start thinking about is, for example, customers that are showing as your will not pay group. Do you want to work those internally, or actually do you potentially want to get them out to your DCA to work them on your behalf? Get your DCAs doing the heavy lifting, allowing them to go after customers that are more difficult to engage. Because what that allows is you as companies to start working with your customers that need your support. People that are genuinely struggling, they potentially do want to pay. Now, it could be those that are specifically in financial difficulty, and if they are, they get referred and they go into a specific area. You'll have a team that will deal with them and will try and help and support them, okay? Compared to those that, for example, have got a medium propensity, what we call a medium low, which is they aren't or will not pay, they're not vulnerable, but they are struggling, they just need your support. Fine, that allows you to have enough resource in your teams to engage with those people, knowing your self-cures are taken care of and your vulnerables have gone elsewhere and your DCAs are doing the work they need to. There was a slide shown earlier, which I thought was quite interesting. It talked about the days on the left-hand side, and it was quite that traditional sort of, almost pre-arrears, 90 days. When you start thinking about data and what you're doing with your customers, do you need to think about the days past due or not? Or actually, do you start thinking about, hold on, at day one missed payment, I know what strategy my customers fall into. And if I think they're a not pay, I'm putting them straight out to DCAs. I'm not waiting 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Why? You're just going to waste time. You actually go, this customer is best suited to go down this path, so we're going to do it from day one. This customer can go down this treatment path from day one. So it allows you to make your treatment paths a lot more sort of flexible. And ultimately, when you know that about your customers, you can start engaging them and trying to get them to pay, get them to pay you. And I think one of the things, particularly when you sort of think about the likes of open banking, the ultimate goal, kind of the dream utopia of where you get to with open banking, is that when you know your customers and you have engagement and you're talking to them and you get access to the data via open banking, you can ask at the point, because it's explicit consent, at the point you get the information, you can ask for as much as you want. What you'll hear is most companies default to 90 days with access for 90 days. But actually, at the point you take the data, you can ask for 12 months, you can ask for 18 months. As long as you can consume it, you can ask as much as you want. So you learn a lot about your customers from the start. What then happens as well is for a lot of people out there, they have fluctuating incomes, but yet they have fixed payment dates and fixed payment amounts that then actually get sort of sent to the clients that people have to then pay for and pay the companies that owe money to. But actually, with open banking, where the utopian world gets to is you know their real income. If you know their real income for that month, in theory, your payment can fluctuate and alter. Okay, so you can come to an arrangement with the customer and go, on a month you earn the full amount, then actually we'll take a maximum of X. Any other months we earn less than that, we'll drop it down. Now at the moment, most IT systems can't cope with that, and that's fine. That's where consumers themselves still aren't really fully on board with open banking. It's a slow burn area, okay? But going forward, thinking about the future, someone talked about 5 years' time, that's the kind of area it's heading to. CRM systems will be able to start managing that. Companies will be able to think about managing it. Regulation will be a challenge. Okay, fine, because how's that going to impact sort of CCA agreements, et cetera, et cetera. So there's bits to take on board, but there's a lot of interesting things that can happen out there. And if you can start and sort of get it right at the beginning of the process, use data to understand your customers. This is just an example that kind of shows the differences that you will see. So for example, customers that you've identified as self-cures, 9 out of 10 of them will pay you. And that's with minimal intervention. Doesn't mean no intervention, say preemptive text or some kind of light touch strategy. Whereas, for example, those will not pay groups, you're down at 9 out of 10 won't. And therefore you need to make sure you have the correct strategies in place. So ultimately, this is all about creating potentially the best outcome for yourselves and for your customers. And if you're using data to shape those processes, what that will do is start to build trust with your customers. When customers are getting those letters, those initial letters, they'll start to go, okay, this company seems to know what they're talking about. I think, yeah, I'll try and talk to them, because we know that's the hardest part, is getting the engagement. So if you can be creative, use data to shape the text of the letters, the kind of letters you're sending them out, when you send the letters out to them, whether it's an email, for example, whether it's a digital strategy, or whether it's a dialer strategy, all of the data can help drive those processes to then go, now I've got engagement, here's a segment I think you fall into. If I have the correct segment, I can ask you the right questions, I can get you on the right journey, I can then understand how much you can afford to pay and get you back on track. Or potentially, what you can't afford to pay, and therefore refer you to a debt management company, one of the debt charities who will be able to help you out to get you back on track. So the advantage of using the data is ultimately, it's kind of that almost day one missed payment strategy. You can go pre-arrears. We talked to companies about that. Some companies almost have evidence that almost trying to do it pre-arrears has caused them more issues. But actually, when you start thinking about consumer duty and helping customers and understanding them, if the data's there, then for some businesses, they look at it and go, okay, fine, we've got the data, this customer is still paying us, they're still managing, so that's fine. But as soon as they miss a payment, from day one, we know what action we're taking, and from day one, we're going to have the best action for that consumer. Others will look at it and go, actually, we are going to run a preemptive strategy. We were talking to a motor finance business recently. Built in to their product offering, they automatically have a 3-month payment holiday that anybody's entitled to. It's part of their offering. So what they're talking about data, or thinking about data, is identify people that they think would benefit from a payment holiday. So their messaging is just going to be, hey, do you know about this? We've got a payment holiday. Do you fancy using it? So not about, are you in financial difficulty? Have you got arrears? They're using the data to drive a process to say, look, this is a standard part of our offering. Do you need a bit of breathing space? Have 3 months off. Again, just an example of how you can use the data to try and drive the processes. So hopefully you found that useful, because data is powerful and trust has to be earned. So if using data analytics to create a detailed picture of your customers allows you to create specific collections or engagement strategies that closest fit your customers' needs. Using data embedded in your processes can create an empathetic customer-centric approach, which is actually really key as well when dealing with your customers. The approach can drive agents' behavior based on the information you actually see, create the right culture, and ultimately lead to more engaged customer base who will view you as a trustworthy company. So what we've tried to do is sort of give you 25 minutes or so just talking a little bit about some of the macro trends within the data. And things aren't quite as bad as some of the mainstream media would have you believe. Yes, there are some challenges, be aware of that. But overall, things are still relatively flat with slight arrears increases in certain specific sectors. Beyond that, we then try to give a bit of an insight into data, how you can use it to drive your processes and build trust with your customers. At that, I'll say thank you very much and take any questions.
Right, does anyone have any questions in the room for me to throw a catch box at them before we go to Slido? Don't all put your hands up at once. We've got anonymous again, thank you. Dennis, if you don't mind doing the honours.
Yeah, sure. So that's a very interesting question. So the future of data usage. So there's a lot of debate around this. So giving consumers control of data is sort of one of the key areas. And there's been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion around, can bureaus almost just become safe harbors for consumers who then give access to the data? You almost own your data like you do your Facebook logon and sort of share it with companies. Now, that's fine, that's one of the options, because that's the kind of evolution of your open banking type data. But also, bureaus ultimately will still have a role to play in this. And if you look at the recent market review and the market study that the FCA completed, they've kind of concluded that, bureaus are quite key. I think reading between the lines, it looks like the FCA want more bureaus to be in the UK rather than less. It's almost like they seem to want one or more than three, basically, is what they seem to be alluding to. And they also want a different regulator to look at the data. Now, for example, things like the SCORE, Steering Committee on Reciprocity, that oversee keys, insight, and share data, that's one of the areas which they're certainly looking at changing. Because at the moment, it's felt to be a bit of a closed group, it's a bit of a club where only the owners can access the data, whereas actually consumers should have more of an input on that, and there does appear there's likely to be more of a regulator on that. So the future does seem to be going, one, bureaus will still be around. How they hold the data, how they use the data is still a core part for acquisition, understanding affordability, and engaging customers. Beyond that, consumers will also still retain more access to their data. We're fairly sure of that going forward, and we'll use a bureau of choice as a safe harbour. That's where I think it's going. Slide and engagement recovery rate focused on phone interaction. Yeah, okay, that's actually a very good question around the digital process relate. So I don't have an answer to that one, and that's mainly because when we did that particular project, they were not using digital engagement. Okay, now, initial thoughts from talking to our clients and working with them is particularly for people in financial difficulty, digital is much harder to understand. Is it actually working at all? They're trying to bury the head in the sand. They're just trying to sort of get through a process. And actually, digital messaging, how are you going to put it? Do you know it's the right person opening it? It's more of a challenge, particularly for those in financial difficulty. Okay, when you talk about the self-cure group, that's actually where they're very key. Use digital to drive them, to engage them. So from a vulnerability side, at the moment, there isn't enough evidence to say either way how positive or negative it is. The general feeling is people in financial distress don't respond quite as well to digital, but once we have more information on that, we can sort of publish it. How do you think energy caps and pending mortgage renewals in increased interest rates will affect your graphs? Okay, that's a great question. I was on a call about this yesterday, where we were having a look at it. So we have been looking at mortgage shock and the potential for mortgage shock. So when you look at it currently at the moment, again, the headline figures are in theory a bit concerning. Now, one of the other bureaus has recently put out a report that since September of last year, 2.9 million people have had increases in mortgage payments. Well, it's true, but that's because quite a few of them are on the standard variable rate. There's actually some evidence at the moment that some people are deliberately switching onto SVRs because they actually think the interest rate's going to go down and they want to be in a position to sort of take benefit out of that. So from our side at the moment, there is a bit of a mortgage shock coming. When you look at how many people drop off their sort of fixed rate deals, particularly this year and into next year, there are some pretty sizable numbers, of which I'm one, so I'm actually going through the process. But one of the things that has happened, particularly in the past 6 months, is after that slightly strange time where we had a very short government and everything went a bit nuts, sort of interest rates are settling down. And they're kind of back to a more normal level. So yes, people's payments are going to be increasing, but when you factor in everything else we're seeing, it doesn't look like it's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back. It appears to be, yes, it's going to impact affordability, but incomes are going up a little bit as well. So yes, there will be some changes. People's mortgage payments are going up. But again, the initial thought and looking at it is there are some customers that are in for a shock, but on the whole, a majority of them will be able to manage the payment changes that are coming through. And that's sort of quite similar from an energy side. We'll see how that goes, because obviously there's been contradictory information on that even this week about the energy cap going up, but the government support dropping off, so it's going to kind of tweak where it goes. So we'll see on that one. We've seen already the impact that the utility bills are having. I say increase, there has been an arrears on utility side, and we'll have to keep an eye on that. If the government keep their extra support in place, which they might do, then I think the impact will be minimal. Okay, and then beyond that, for the rest of this year, as inflation eases and all the prices start to drop, again, people should be able to keep managing it.
I think, leave the mics back on. I think we've got about 11 more questions have come through.
Okay.
So if it's okay with you, if maybe we could send them, pop them in a post and issue it out to the rest of the audience, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, fine. No
Perfect.
problem at all.
Dennis, please put your hands together. A fantastic presentation on data.